Over the course of this year, something has become very clear to me. And it's not of a theory, not from books, not from trends, but from hundreds of conversations with real business owners I've had who are actually in the field, doing the work, grinding it out every day. And what I found that's so interesting is that when people talk about their year, they rarely describe it as a failure. They don't say they quit. They don't say they gave up. They don't say they've made bad decisions on purpose. What they describe, almost without realizing it, is a slow shift away from intention and just into reaction. And the longer I listened, the more I realized how common that kind of a shift really is. So at the beginning of the year, almost everyone had some version of a plan. Not a fantasy, not a vision board, but a real, grounded sense of what they wanted to change in their business. For some, it was tightening operations because they were just tired of the chaos on job sites. For others, it was consistency in marketing because they were sick of the feast or famine cycles, which I'm sure everybody knows. For some, it was hiring or upgrading equipment or finally building systems so the business didn't depend entirely on them. These were not unrealistic goals. In fact, most of them were very long overdue. Staffing issues, jobs taking longer than expected, equipment friction, the constant mental load of being the one who has to make everything work even when you're tired. And what I noticed is that nobody consciously decided to abandon their plan. What happened instead was far more subtle and far more dangerous. They started making do. They started making do with how things were. I heard this again and again in conversations about operations. Owners talking about how much time it takes just to get set up to do a job. How inefficient certain processes still are. How they know there are better systems out there, but they're already stretched thin. One owner talked about being tired of his setup. Tired of fighting with equipment, tired of losing energy before the real work even started. And what stood out wasn't the complaint. It was the resignation underneath it. The sense that this friction had become normal. And when friction becomes normal, improvement stops becoming urgent. What happens next is not laziness. It's literally survival mode. Because when you're physically exhausted and mentally overloaded, the first thing that disappears is reflection on how things are going. So what started happening now is weekly reviews were getting skipped. The numbers weren't getting looked at closely. Follow-up becomes inconsistent. Marketing becomes something you do when you remember instead of something that you manage. And the business keeps moving forward, just not enough to keep you busy, but definitely not enough to change the direction of your business. I saw most of this clearly during some slow periods when we were trying to help them gain more business. When work dipped and things got slow, the conversation often shifts towards hope, hoping it picks up, hoping the phone rings more, hoping next month looks different, hoping spring fixes what winter exposed. And hope feels reasonable in the moment, especially when you're already drained, but hope has a cost if it replaces your action. And one of the biggest lies I saw reinforced this year is the idea that being busy means you're doing well. And I've talked to owners who were working nonstop in extreme conditions, putting in brutal days, and they wore that business like proof that they were committed. And just to be clear, they were committed to their business. They weren't avoiding the work, but business without direction does not create progress. It creates endurance. Endurance alone is not a growth strategy. Because while you're hoping, you're not adjusting. And while you're not adjusting, the same problems quietly carry forward into the next season. Another thing that stood out to me this year was silence. Silence in response to questions about goals. Silence when people asked how the year went. Silence around accountability. And that silence isn't because people don't care. It's because admitting drifting like that is just uncomfortable. It's easier to stay busy than to say, I stopped steering the ship. So just being honest, when you're working hard, it feels honorable. But measuring progress forces a verdict, and verdicts can sting. At the same time, I watched a smaller group of owners move through the same year differently. Not louder, not flashier. They didn't pretend the year was easy. They dealt with the same weather, the same staffing headaches, the same market fluctuations, but the difference was that they stayed engaged with their business at a leadership level, even when it was inconvenient, when nobody was watching. They didn't wait to feel motivated. They didn't wait for clarity. They didn't wait for things to calm down. They just kept checking in and making sure the business was doing what it was supposed to do. They had some version of a regular review, whether it was weekly or bi-weekly, where they looked at leads, revenue, schedules, cash, and just the friction points in their business and what was causing them. And when something wasn't working, they didn't treat it as a personal failure or a sign to abandon the plan for the year. They treated it pretty much like we should, which is information. And with information, they made adjustments. And with that, Sometimes the adjustment was small, sometimes it was uncomfortable, but they stayed in the driver's seat. What became obvious to me is that planning was never the problem. Almost everyone planned. The real difference was what people did when the plan met resistance and it just didn't go as you planned it. Some people interpret resistance as a signal to pause. Others interpret it as feedback, and feedback only helps if you're still paying attention to the business. The moment you stop reviewing, stop measuring, stop questioning assumptions, the drift in your business just takes over. Now, another pattern that I couldn't ignore was how skeptical some of the owners have become of shortcuts, and rightly so. There's a deep fatigue around anyone claiming to have a magic answer. You might have seen it in some of these groups. Most of the problems people are facing don't require clever solutions. What they require is boring ass discipline, systems, checklist, showing up and being consistent, regular attention. They needed decisions to be made before confidence arrived. And I know none of that sounds exciting, but it works. And the owners who accepted that earlier are the ones who ended the year with momentum instead of just stories of how hard it was. If there's advice in any of this, it's not about doing more. It's about doing fewer things deliberately. Most of the owners who felt stuck this year weren't lazy or incapable. They were overextended and underdirected. They worked hard, but they didn't give themselves a structure that forced ongoing leadership. And sometimes that leadership is just about leading yourself. And without that structure, those businesses defaulted into reaction mode instead of following the plan. So as we move forward towards the next year, the question isn't whether you can write a better plan, because let's be honest, you probably can. The question is whether you're willing to build a rhythm that keeps you engaged with the plan when things get uncomfortable. Because they will. I promise you they will. This upcoming year, 2026, it will interrupt you. Employees will surprise you. Markets will wobble. Weather will do what it always does. And none of that is avoidable. What is avoidable is your disappearance from the leadership role when things get noisy in your business. The owners who were able to change the trajectory of their business this year didn't rely on motivation. They relied on presence. They showed up to the uncomfortable parts of the business consistently. They reviewed numbers when the numbers weren't flattering. They addressed friction instead of stepping around it. They accepted that consistency would matter more than intensity. And over time, those small, unglamorous behaviors compounded into something meaningful. And what I would challenge anyone listening to this to think about is not what you want next year to look like, but what you're willing to stay engaged with week after week. What numbers you're willing to look at honestly. What systems you're willing to build, even though you're tired. And what efficiencies you're willing to finally eliminate from your business, even though you've been staring at them for years. And what conversations have you been avoiding because they require change and maybe a little uncomfortable? Direction doesn't come from ambition alone. It comes from attention applied regularly. So what this year taught me, if anything, through observation more than advice, is that drifting from your plan is rarely intentional, but it is always expensive when you let it go on. And the antidote isn't hype or inspiration. What it is leadership expressed through repetition. Not dramatic overhauls, not overnight transformations, just steady steering of the ship applied consistently, even when it feels boring, even when it feels inconvenient, and even when it feels like nothing is happening yet. Because the business that quietly improved this year didn't find a secret. What they did was stayed present long enough to notice what needed to change, and then they were disciplined enough to act on it before another year slipped by. And that, more than anything else that I've seen, is what separates the business owners who keep repeating the same year from the ones who slowly, almost quietly, build something better for the next year. So here's to look into 2026, not as a magical reset because the calendar year changed, but as the year that you stay present instead of drifting away from your plans. Choose a clear direction and start steering on purpose again, even when it's inconvenient, even when you're tired, even when the season gets weird. Because when you do that, you can finally stop confusing business with progress, and you can build that boring discipline that actually compounds, doing the weekly reviews, small adjustments to your systems that hold up when motivation doesn't. So when you look back next December, meaning December 2026, you don't just say the year went fast. You can say that it moved forward because what you planned led you there.